of you being with us today for this event. Our speakers today are Professor Baude and Mr. Ilya Shapiro. Mr. Shapiro is an alumni of our very own law school at the University of Chicago. He's a senior constitutional fellow at the Cato Institute, as well as the editor-in-chief of the Cato Supreme Court Review. He regularly contributes to a variety of publications, academic, professional, and popular, and is also a regular contributor to a variety of media outlets, from CNN to Fox, NBC, you name it. He also clerked for private practice with Judge Grady Jolly on the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals. Professor Baude is a professor here at our very own law school. He is also the faculty director of the Constitutional Law Institute here. Teaches Fed courts, common law, and elements, as I'm sure you all know. He has a BS in mathematics from the University of Chicago and a JD from Yale Law School. And prior to that, he clerked for, well, after school, he clerked for then Judge Michael McConnell on the Court of Appeals and Chief Justice Roberts on the Supreme Court. So without further ado, Mr. Shapiro, take it away.
Thanks, Sarah. It's great to be back here at my alma mater. It's great to see so many people. I mean, this room is almost full. That's awesome, even though they only announced the topic, I think, on Monday. Originally, I was going to be talking about Supreme Court reform. I just published a book a year ago on the politics of judicial nominations, Supreme Disorder, still available. At really good price on Amazon this week. I saw it like stocking stuff for like $5 or something, but anyway. You know, speaking of the last week of the quarter, you all have term papers and whatnot. Unfortunately, Professor Baude and his colleagues were delinquent and didn't turn in their term paper, the report of the Presidential Commission on the Supreme Court. But unlike all of you, they just sua sponte gave themselves an extension for a month. Wouldn't that be great if you could do that, right? So, alas, you're not in school a month from now. I can't come here. You wouldn't fill the, you know, not even the promise of deep dish pizza would probably fill this room in mid-December. So here we are talking about something completely different, voting rights in America today. So let's jump right in. Although it's never been easier to vote in America, the voting wars have flared up again. Though they've never stopped since Donald Trump was elected, or the Supreme Court decided Shelby County, or really Bush v. Gore. This time, a new Georgia law, the Election Integrity Act of 2021, Senate Bill 202, triggered national apoplexy this spring, with Democrats declaring it and similar laws in Iowa, Texas, and other places the new Jim Crow. Such comparisons are insulting to civil rights advocates from the 1960s, incendiary to a public discourse already hampered by low institutional trust, and disingenuous. Sorting out fact from fiction is not only important for this particular law, but to understand the general debate over election regulation. SB 202 limits ballot drop boxes to places they can't be tampered with, like early voting sites. Standardizes weekend voting hours and asks people to write a driver's license or social security number on absentee ballot envelopes. Jim Crow, meanwhile, was literacy tests and poll taxes, having to guess how many bubbles are in a bar of soap, and battling billy clubs and police dogs on the way to the precinct. Indeed, the Washington Post gave Biden 4 Pinocchios for claiming that SB 202 was Jim Crow in the 21st century, for limiting voting hours and denying the right to vote to countless voters. That paper, not exactly a right-wing rag, reported that, quote, experts say the net effect was to expand the opportunities to vote for most Georgians, not limit them. SB 202 does indeed improve voting access for most Georgians, entrenching new opportunities to vote early and absentee that were introduced during the pandemic. For example, during a generous, at least compared to blue states such as New York and the president's own home state of Delaware, during a generous 17 days of in-person early voting, voting locations have to be open at least 8 hours, with county officials given leeway to adjust the time to suit their constituents. Election day voting hours are even longer, and the window for requesting absentee ballots, which can be done online, is reduced to a mere 67 days, starting 11 weeks and closing 11 days before an election, to allow time for the ballot to be mailed out and returned. More restrictive proposals were floated early in the drafting process, such as eliminating no-excuse absentee voting entirely, which, by the way, is the current policy of 16 states, including such retrogrades as Connecticut and New Hampshire, and prohibiting early voting on Sundays, criticized as targeting souls to the polls programs. But these measures never made it into the enacted law. Gabriel Sterling, who's a Republican official who got attention for countering Trump's election disinformation, explained that some provisions, quote, were phantoms that the leadership in both the Senate and the House told their guys, hey, introduce whatever you need to cover yourself with your people. In other words, given the level of distrust and anger in the electorate, state legislators had to show that they were tough on fraud, even if they knew certain things weren't going to be in the final reform package. That said, these phantom provisions certainly hobbled the reception of the final law. Democrats could hardly be blamed for seeing ill intent if the crafting process included winks and nods at fictitious fraud claims. Trump's insistence that he lost several states due to widespread fraud has led about 2/3 of Republican voters not to believe Joe Biden to be legitimately elected. So it's no surprise that election reform has become a priority for GOP-controlled legislators. But ballot integrity isn't synonymous with voter suppression, even if this fact was undermined by the legislature itself. So the Georgia law removes Georgia Secretary of State Brad Raffensperger, the main target of Trump's ire for not finding the votes to flip the state, from the state election board. Still, Raffensperger issued a statement that, quote, Democrats and national media outlets asserting that Georgia's election reform will restrict access to voting are just partisan talking points, not facts. Sterling echoed that assessment in a tweet that sums up the larger state of affairs. Quote, the claim of voter suppression has the same level of truth as the claims of voter fraud in the last election. I think that's basically a good summary of where we are with voting in America. We don't really have systemic voter suppression or systemic voter fraud. Still, public pressure from outside the state led Major League Baseball to move the All-Star game out of Atlanta. This after Democratic state and local officials begged them not to do so, warning that it punished minority-owned businesses and black workers the most. Georgia activist Stacey Abrams saw her own misleading criticism backfire when her pleas to Commissioner Rob Manfred went ignored. And Will Smith announced that he was moving the production of his Civil War film out of Georgia. Hyperbolic attacks on ballot integrity thus not only decrease trust in the system nationally, but can have sharp consequences locally. And comparing Georgia to other states also adds crucial context that undermines the Jim Crow narrative. When New Jersey recently passed a law keeping early voting to 9 days, requiring only some polling locations to be open, and limiting mandatory Sunday hours, there was no social media opposition or corporate hand-wringing. Abrams even lauded the move because, quote, our democracy is made strong when we make it easier for the people's voice to be heard. Nor are there calls to boycott New York, which had no early voting at all until last fall, when new rules created 9 days of in-person early voting, again, compared to 17 in the new Georgia law. Or Delaware, whose new early voting legislation doesn't take effect until next year. 6 states still have no provision whatsoever for in-person early voting, and I dare you to find some common thread among Connecticut, Kentucky, Mississippi, Missouri, New Hampshire, and South Carolina. And yet, after Commissioner Manfred announced that he was moving baseball's Midsummer's Classic, he didn't clean out his Manhattan office. And baseball's Hall of Fame is also in New York, which has, quote, abysmal election administration, the progressive UC Irvine election law scholar Rick Hasson told The Atlantic. Hasson added that if New York, quote, were a Southern Republican state, there would be protests and calls for businesses to boycott because it's that terrible. But it's a blue state, so you don't see that. In fall 2018, before a recent legislative change, 2 scholars at NYU's Brennan Center called the state's voting system worst in the country. Granted, New York's shortcomings tend to flow from incompetence, neglect, and corruption rather than Trumpist conspiracy, but 2 wrongs don't make a right. Yet the voting rights debate remains focused on the Peach State, whose election law, after an exceedingly close presidential race and 2 Senate runoffs marred by charges of fraud and suppression, aims to improve voter access while strengthening ballot integrity. It's hardly Jim Crow on steroids, as Biden told ESPN. Attempts by progressive groups and Democratic politicians to tie the law to segregation and systemic racial disenfranchisement are thus remarkably dishonest. Even the bizarre attack on the provision purportedly limiting the distribution of water to voters waiting in line is all wet. Many states have similar anti-vote buying rules, which make it illegal to send people in NRA t-shirts and MAGA hats to hand out free Koch brothers financed Federal Society branded pizza to voters. To again pick on the Empire State, New York explicitly prohibits giving voters, quote, meat, drink, tobacco, refreshment, or provision unless the sustenance is worth less than $1 and the person providing it isn't identified. So to be perfectly clear, under the new Georgia law, poll workers can still provide water to voters, and anyone can donate food or drink for election voters to set out for those waiting in line. As for voter ID, the new Georgia law simply adds a requirement that voters provide the number of their driver's license or free state ID card to apply for a ballot. Same rule as in California, New Jersey, Virginia, and one of those items, or the last 4 digits of Social Security number when returning it. Surely applying a numerical voter verification to these ballots is better than the inexact science of signature matching. Colorado, a blue state that votes entirely by mail, rejected 29,000 ballots in the 2020 election, about 1 out of every 112, because the signatures didn't match those on file. And that doesn't count the 11,000 who were allowed to cure by texting in a picture of, you guessed it, a photo ID. Illustrating the point further, the Tampa Bay Times came out with a funny article earlier this year about how Florida Governor Ron DeSantis' signature has changed over the years, apparently leading to his ballot being tossed in 2016. Voter ID more generally is hugely popular, including among Democrats, 56% in a recent AP poll, African Americans, 69% in a recent Rasmussen poll, despite in-person voter fraud being exceedingly rare. The strongest argument for voter ID is that it instills confidence in the system, not that it actually prevents much fraud. And majorities of all racial groups, 64% of whites, 59% of blacks, 58% of other minorities, reject the claim that voter ID laws discriminate. Indeed, many democratic countries require voter ID of some form, including Canada, France, Germany, India, Israel, Italy, and Sweden. To top it off, the bipartisan 2005 Commission on Federal Election Reform, led by Jimmy Carter and James Baker, recommended voter ID as one of many common sense reforms to promote election integrity. And as the Supreme Court explained in Crawford versus Marion County, a 6-3 decision written by that right-wing zealot John Paul Stevens, such requirements are constitutional so long as the state doesn't unduly burden the ability to get an ID. And anyway, a recent National Bureau of Economic Research study found that these provisions have, quote, no negative effect on registration or turnout, either overall or for any race, gender, or age group. Georgia and Tennessee, earlier this decade, or I guess last decade at this point, when they put in their voter ID laws, found that turnout actually increased, especially among racial minorities. Even as it's hard to believe that SB 202 stops a single voter from casting a ballot, Senator Elizabeth Warren, a Democrat from Massachusetts, another state without no excuse absentee voting, tweeted, quote, the Republican who is sitting in Stacey Abrams' chair just signed a despicable voter suppression bill into law to take Georgia back to Jim Crow. So Warren not only furthered misinformation about SB 202, but resurrected the toxic myth that Governor Brian Kemp stole his 2018 election. That's an evidence-challenged allegation that Kemp's 55,000 vote margin came from about 100,000 people being improperly removed from the rolls. Abrams' charge continues to feed a left-wing narrative of racial disenfranchisement, one that seems impervious to evidence of increased black voter turnout, including in states with so-called stricter requirements. Many states that Shelby County freed from a requirement to pre-clear with the federal government any changes in election regulation have consistently had higher black voter registration and turnout rates than the rest of the country. Georgia and Mississippi have higher black registration rates than white. It could be understandable that blacks voted at higher rates when Barack Obama was on the ballot, but those elections continued long-term trends. And even though black turnout dipped in 2016, basically to pre-Obama levels, the Pew Center found that in the 2018 midterms, all major racial and ethnic groups saw historic jumps in turnout. Voting statistics put paid to the concerns, however sincere, of those who criticized Shelby County when it came out, and who still criticize it, and laws that it facilitated. At the time, President Obama intoned that the ruling upsets decades of well-established practices that help make sure voting is fair, while Hillary Clinton opined that citizens will be disenfranchised, victimized by the law instead of served by it. This in reaction to a decision that merely eased out what was supposed to be a temporary provision, Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act, enacted in 1965 to provide federal oversight of state elections based on that era's racial disparities. While politicians and pundits irresponsibly liken the ruling to sanctioning Bull Connor's dogs and the murder of Medgar Evers, it actually shows the strength of voting protections. The court simply found that the coverage formula for a jurisdiction subject to preclearance was unconstitutional because it was based on 40-year-old data, such that covered states no longer corresponded to incidents of racial discrimination in voting. So, just as the court was correct in 1966 to approve the constitutional deviation that preclearance represented as an uncommon remedy to the exceptional conditions in the Jim Crow South, it was correct in 2013 to restore the constitutional order. While Justice Ginsburg in dissent compared ending preclearance to throwing away your umbrella because you're no longer getting wet, it's actually more like stopping chemotherapy when the cancer of Jim Crow is eradicated, actual Jim Crow. As Justice Thomas wrote in another voting rights case 4 years earlier, disabling preclearance, quote, represents a fulfillment of the 15th Amendment's promise of full enfranchisement and honors the success achieved by the VRA. Instead, corporate and media elites focus on a decision that, far from removing protections for racial minorities' voting rights, declared an end to the state of emergency that existed when those rights actually were systematically threatened. Indeed, the key Voting Rights Act provision, Section 2, allowing suits against discriminatory state actions, remains very much in effect. The court in Brnovich versus DNC just this past term gave guidance on how to apply it, which it had never done before outside the context of redistricting. So this is why Brnovich is important, because it gives guidance on these very important Section 2 claims. At issue in Brnovich were an out-of-precinct policy, your vote doesn't count if you don't vote in the right precinct, and an anti-ballot harvesting rule. Both of these rules are very common, so it was no surprise that the Obama Justice Department didn't challenge them, and the Biden Justice Department actually supported them, albeit on other grounds than Arizona defended them on. But in any event, the question here is whether these rules or rules going forward violate Section 2 as amended in 1982 to state that, quote, no voting qualification or prerequisite shall be imposed or applied by any state or subdivision in a manner which results in a denial or abridgment of the right to vote on account of race or color. Results in a denial or abridgment of the right to vote on account of race or color. And the court upheld both of those, that was no surprise, and then came up with a multi-factor balancing test, which will be important going forward, but basically says rules that were in place in 1982, rules that don't have a severely disparate impact as between members of different racial groups, these are generally okay, and you should look at courts, you should look at opportunities to vote and equal opportunities to vote as a whole, not whether early voting hours were cut 2 hours here and a day added there and things like that. A pretty sensible decision, I think. More broadly, it's easier to register to vote today than at any other time in America's history. The permanent nationwide provisions of the Voting Rights Act, Section 2 and also Section 3, which if there is kind of a mini Jim Crow in some county or jurisdiction can impose judicial supervision, are more than adequate to protect voting rights in those rare instances where discrimination occurs. There's no need to bring back preclearance or implement a new vastly expanded Section 5 that H.R. 4, the John Lewis Act, represents. There's no longer any justification for giving the federal government the ability to veto the election laws or regulations that citizens and their elected representatives choose to implement in their respective states. Or, as Wall Street Journal columnist Jason Riley concluded in a provocatively titled piece titled, quote, "The Democrats are stuck in 1964, it's clear that when blacks are sufficiently motivated, they have little trouble meeting the same requirements that other groups meet and casting a vote. Democrats continue to claim that Republicans are advocating modern-day poll taxes and literacy tests in disguise, even as evidence to the contrary continues to mount." And so we get these tired Jim Crow tropes every time a Republican legislature tweaks election laws. Of course, the reason we're seeing new election laws now in both red and blue states isn't just the latest iteration in the politicization of voting, or even a reaction and counter-reaction to President Trump's post-election shenanigans. It's that the pandemic forced a chaotic process of ad hoc changes, including a huge number of mailed ballots that local officials didn't have the capacity to efficiently process. And not just absentee or mail voting was expanded. Ballot harvesting, the automatic mailing of ballots to all registered voters, led to unique electoral processes. And then local officials and state courts changed rules on the fly, including those regarding the validity of ballots arriving after Election Day or without confirmable voter identification. This free-for-all was a recipe not just for chaos, but a further lessening of political trust and increase in perceptions of both fraud and suppression at a time when that trust was already in short supply. And so states moved to rein in some of the looseness, to codify the regulations that would apply to absentee, early, and mailed ballots under normal circumstances. Different states can rightly take different approaches to achieve the common goal of making it easy to vote but hard to cheat, just as they take differing approaches to administering other government programs. There's no platonic ideal of early voting days and hours, for example. Where you draw the line is a technocratic policy debate that can vary in urban versus rural areas and also depends on other aspects of overall election law. But Democratic criticism of Iowa for reducing early voting from 29 to 20 days is disingenuous when DC, Delaware, Hawaii, Maryland, New York, and 16 other states all have shorter periods. And slamming the Hawkeye State for closing polls at 8 p.m. after opening at 7 a.m. is rich, given that California, DC, Delaware, Massachusetts, and Rhode Island have the exact same hours. Even from a progressive perspective, the outrage is much ado about nothing because, as the New York Times has reported, quote, making voting convenient doesn't necessarily translate into more votes. And convenience isn't the only criterion for voting rules. The ultimate goal is to preserve our orderly system of democratic decision-making and therefore the legitimacy of the governance it produces. Democracy is complicated, but voting should be simple. And it largely is, at least when there's no pandemic. So simple that majorities of all races, 59% of whites, 56% of blacks, 63% of other minorities, say it's more important to prevent fraud than to make it easier to vote. This isn't rocket science. You register, you get a ballot, you mark a box, you deliver the ballot, your vote's counted. But lurking behind that ideal is the need to maintain accurate voter rolls, have enough polling places so voters don't wait an unreasonable amount of time, and ensure speed and transparency in tabulation. The 2020 election failed on all those counts in many states, without anything nefarious necessarily going on. Calling laws that try to create better post-pandemic mechanisms Jim Crow 2.0 is just as dangerous to confidence in our political institutions as spreading myths about illegitimate voting. If American democracy is in peril, my colleague Walter Olson concluded, he was a co-chair of Maryland's Redistricting Commission, he said, if American democracy is in peril, laws of this sort are not very good evidence for that proposition. Thanks very much. I look forward to Professor Baude's comments.
Thank you, Ilya. So yeah, I'm very sorry we couldn't get our paper in on time. You can feel free to dock us several letter grades when you grade our work. I'm already worried we're going to be struggling to get the median. But I'm very grateful that you're here and talking about this because I think it's an incredibly important topic, right? The law, election law, the law of democracy. How do we handle one of the basic questions of American government? And I'll say it's something, it gives me a chance to ask you for insight about something that's been puzzling me for years, which is, we have these voting wars. What are we fighting about and why, is my question. So I think it's completely correct, as you suggested many times, that a lot of the laws that are described as incredibly disenfranchising, the second coming of Jim Crow, etc., the best empirical evidence by scholars with no axe to grind suggests that many of these laws have no real disenfranchising effect. Voter ID laws, the best studies suggest, have no appreciable effect on elections, in part because the set of people who don't have and can't get a voter ID are often the same set of people who probably weren't voting anyway. Many of the same barriers to access to the DMV are also barriers to the access to the polling place, so it just washes out. Our dean, back when he was on our faculty, Tom Miles, wrote the leading study finding many of the same facts about felon disenfranchisement even, which is a much more dramatic and constitutionally permissible policy, but most of the evidence is that it rarely has any effect on elections, again, because it largely applies to a set of people who were unlikely to vote anyway. This is true. Another one of our Bigelow Fellows has been writing a paper about finding this about voter purges. So when the Republicans go through and try to clear a bunch of people off the voting rolls, and there's a question of whether they're disenfranchising people, the best evidence is it doesn't seem to do very much. It doesn't seem to have very much effect. Now, on the other hand, the same studies also suggest these laws usually have very few benefits. There's not a lot of in-person voter fraud in the first place that voter ID is solving. So it's a kind of like solution to a non-problem that also doesn't really have any costs. It's just kind of pointless. Much the same thing is true of the purges. It seems like very few of the people who get purged were otherwise going to vote and are otherwise stopped. Same thing, so up and down the line. So far as I can tell, the best social science empirical evidence is none of this stuff matters in either direction. I mean, again, there are always close races someplace. There are perhaps symbolic fights or symbolic values. This I'll talk about in a second. But in terms of I'm led to believe from all of the articles I read that either the Republicans are fighting to make sure that they will get to stay in power, and I'm supposed to be in favor of that if I like Republicans because they're going to make sure that bad people don't vote, or the opposite, that the Republicans are fighting to maintain some stranglehold and that they're disenfranchising people. And as far as I can tell, the people who actually try to study these things as best we can tell, this is largely overhyped on both sides. It seems like there's a huge amount of energy going into something that seems not to have much of an effect in the world. So this is my puzzle: is why is this happening? What are we fighting about? Now, when I discovered this, my first thought was to put on another Chicago hat and say, well, probably the studies are wrong, right? The people who actually have skin in the game, right? The Republican legislators who actually really care about finding a way to win, they think these laws help them win. So they probably know what they're doing. They do this for a living. And it's just that the pointy-headed academics in Cambridge haven't figured out why it works. That there's some sort of hidden logic of crowds. And same thing on the other side. The civil rights groups, who really have skin in the game, they think it's really important to challenge these laws. They probably know what they're doing, and we're just we're missing it. That's my point. I will say, if that's right, I'd love to know more about it. Because the more I've looked at it, and the more I've talked to people, even some of the people involved in these things off the record, that doesn't seem to be what's going on. So you can talk to even people who bring some of these lawsuits off the record, and sometimes they'll say, yeah, we kind of know this is true. We don't really understand why we're bringing this lawsuit, but we are, or it's something that was important to us to bring. So this just further puzzles me as to what is this all about? So I have two hypotheses, and I'm curious whether these ring true. And I think they're right, but anyway, I'm curious. Hypothesis one is money. Is that it turns out that both passing so-called election integrity laws is a good way to raise money on the right, and challenging them, challenging so-called voter suppression laws is a good way to raise money on the left. And so at this point, you have multiple kind of partisan interest groups that are just looking for support, and this is what their constituents want to see. They're happy to give money for more guns in the voting war and more battles in the voting wars. And so both sides are just geared up for this because that's what everybody wants to see. It does remind me a little bit about the dynamics in the confirmation process, although maybe there it's at least a little more clear what everybody's fighting about. But I just wonder, so is that part of it? And again, I've heard people who are supportive of some of these causes on both sides say that that's part of it. That part of how they decide what causes to pick is that's where the public enthusiasm is, which means that's where the donor dollars are, which means that's where we are. So if that's right, if we have this giant set of litigation and public conversation about, say, voter ID laws because that's where the money is, I find that disturbing, and I wonder if there's something we can do to stop it. Maybe that's not what's going on, but that's one thing that worries me. The other possibility, and I guess this is more true on the right than the left, is that this is about political signaling. And Ilya mentioned the sort of Donald Trump Raffensperger effect, but so this is about the big lie, right? So if you are a rank and file Republican trying to rise to prominence in your party without saying something so crazy that you become a laughing stock, but also without getting primaried, you need to find some way to do something that seems responsible, but also signals that you're on the team. And because of President Trump's complaints with the last election, his allegations of fraud, supporting anti-fraud legislation seems like a good way to do that. It's a good way to, like, without having to actually come out and say something either way, you can sort of signal that you support, you believe the big lie, that Donald Trump won the 2020 election, you support making that not happen again. And if the worst you can say about it is it's all kind of harmless and pointless, as a politician, that's a win-win. Like, you can do something that's good for your career and doesn't hurt the world. It's better than a lot of things politicians do. so then maybe I'm more okay with it. I'm like, look, if politicians are going to have to find some way to signal, to virtue signal or vice signal, may as well be this. Could be much worse. But at the same time, I'm sort of disturbed if that's the main reason we're having these fights is as a sort of like party line signaling. That also seems really troubling. So I guess it's my main puzzle is like, am I right this is going on, or is there more to it than this? And I should say, I bracket against something like districting. So drawing districts, that's really important. That has consequences. We do that every 10 years. We're doing it now. Thanks to the Supreme Court's blessing in Rucho versus Common Cause, states are allowed to gerrymander the other party, within an inch of their life and try to get extra seats. Democrats are doing it in Illinois. Republicans are doing it in lots of their states. That has consequences. I get that. And yet, much of the press and much of the litigation is not focused on the gerrymandering. There's some stories about the maps, but they don't seem to sell nearly as much as voter ID, voter fraud, voter suppression, like that sort of stuff. So I guess I'm wondering if we fail to keep our eye on the ball. So, and then I guess two last sort of takeaways with this. So one, does that tell us anything about how the courts should think about this? I'm inclined to think that this means the federal courts should have a pretty deferential view for all all state laws that don't deal with some explicit constitutional rule, right? Okay, show me something that discriminates on the basis of race or sex or age or imposes a poll tax, the things the Constitution actually speaks to, and the courts should really get involved. But if it's the other broader sets of concerns, sort of under the unenumerated voting rights jurisprudence, maybe this is just a further sign the courts should not take the bait. That might mean Shelby County is also wrong, because there's also it also seems sort of like an unenumerated voting rights claim on behalf of the states, where the states are saying they have some unenumerated right in the Constitution not to have different laws in different states or to have their own laws. Maybe the Supreme Court should just stayed out of that one too. But I guess I'm wondering, should the Supreme Court just stop participating in the voting wars, except where the Constitution's actually involved? That's question one. And then I guess question two is is there something we can do about this more broadly? I guess the good side. I try to put a good spin on this. I'd say the good side of this, I guess, is that we believe in democracy so much that one of the best tactics as an interest group to try to raise money is to convince people you're fighting for democracy. There's just lots and lots of money in democracy, and so maybe it's good that when you really want to get attention, you do it through fighting about voting. Maybe that's good. The bad news is that our faith, apparently, in our own institutions are so low that everybody is convinced the rules are rigged against them, and that they would win if only the rules were not rigged anymore, or they could get in there and unrig the rules, which does sort of concern me about where we are as a country. And so then I guess it just makes me wonder, are the voting wars, like most wars, expensive, destabilizing, pointless, and ultimately probably not worth it? Should we make peace instead of war?
I agree with all of that, except for the possible suggestion that Shelby County might be wrong, because I believe that all of the Constitution is enforceable, and Section 2 of the 15th Amendment says that Congress shall have power to enforce this article by appropriate legislation. So the question is, what's appropriate legislation? In 1966, federal supervision of the morally bankrupt state election agencies was appropriate, but it is no longer, and certainly the coverage formula has to match, even if you don't go along with Clarence Thomas on saying no Section 5 could possibly be justified. But anyway, on the broader point, I agree that the voting wars are phony wars, except they're even worse than that. They harm our public discourse. They're mainly wars between partisan elites and activists. I quoted, the various surveys. People on the ground are not so concerned with these sorts of things, as well as turnout and registration rates and things like that. And moreover, even if you look at a first derivative function of the voting wars. It's not even clear that any given level of turnout favors a particular party, right? There's a really good essay in the last issue of National Affairs, I think, that looks at this, but it's not the only one. It's just apparently, along with those studies that Will was looking at, I've been reading studies about turnout because I'm convinced that, you know, the kind of myth that we have, maybe it was true at a certain point that higher turnout was better for Democrats, but it's certainly not the case anymore, particularly where we have these multiple methods of voting these days, and you don't know, you know, whose voters are going to turn out early or absentee or whatever. So yeah, the whole thing is about money, political signaling, maintaining the grift, as some people say pejoratively, on both sides. What should courts do? Well, when they're presented with a valid case, the court had to interpret Section 2 for that matter. But when it when it has opportunities to stay out, like with redistricting, and whether, you know, the Constitution has some sort of standard for when you use politics too much, the answer is no, it doesn't. Then it should stay out of those. But otherwise, yeah, I think I agree with all of that kind of analysis, and I'm happy to answer or dodge any questions that you might have. Right there.
So, my question is response to something Mr. Baude said, which is the court should maybe just stay out of this. So I'm just wondering, how does that exactly look like? So the in-court could deny search, but that doesn't prevent lower federal courts from getting involved. So I know in Russo, that's a political question doctrine case, and for partisan gerrymandering, it's a political question, but one person, one vote, that's still judiciable. For things like race discrimination, that's 14th Amendment claims. So I'm just curious, like, what does the trajectory look? Is it an expansion of the political question doctrine, or is it another way for courts, or the Supreme Court in particular, to set a standard where the courts are not going to get as involved?
I mean, I guess there's two possible approaches, right? So one is substantively, to just start finding ways to uphold these laws and tell lower courts to uphold these laws. And that's kind of what this court has done. When they hear a voter ID case, then Justice Stevens writes a very deferential opinion, saying these laws will generally be okay. The court's also added things like, there's something called, the court calls the Purcell principle, which says even if the law might be illegal, if the election's coming up, just leave it in place. We don't want to disrupt like the rules of the game, what's going on. So that's like option one. But I guess I do wonder, like, maybe option two of just like all cases involving election law should be presumptively non-cert worthy, because this is all nonsense in which the litigation is itself a fundraising vehicle. Would not be a totally crazy view. Now that would leave like erroneous Ninth Circuit decisions in place, like in Brnovich. It would leave in place a lot of decisions other places. But I do kind of wonder if that would actually have a bigger effect on the whole thing, is people would start realizing this is not a ticket to the Supreme Court. There is mandatory appellate jurisdiction over statewide redistricting cases. The court would still have those. Again, that might be good. So that's my more radical suggestion is like maybe the court should just do something else.
Oh yeah, thanks. So I have two questions for Professor Shapiro. So first, you suggested that Section 33 of SB 202, which is the provision outlining the distribution of food at full sites, you analogized that to New York's law, suggesting that it was about vote buying because the New York law, but the New York law only applies to people who are wearing T-shirts or who are with an identifiable organization, and so there's an implicit quid pro quo that legislatures are worried about. I'm wondering, whereas Georgia's law does not have anything about being identified with an organization. I just looked at the text of the statute. So I'm wondering what you think the possible good faith rationale for Georgia's prohibition on distributing food at workplaces could possibly be. And then second, more generally, you conceded in your earlier remarks that there doesn't seem to be any kind of widespread concern about voter fraud, and you suggested that
No, there's widespread concern.
sorry, that there's no empirically valid support for that concern, and you suggested that a lot of the provisions in Georgia's bill were a reaction to kind of some chaos that was caused by changes and sort of these ad hoc changes to the voting process that was generated by COVID. I'm just wondering what the sort of food at the polling places provision and also the the limitation on drop box use, you know, you might think that that's actually helpful. That the increased uses of drop boxes are more helpful for mid-pandemic voting. And it's true that there's no concern about fraud generated by those drop box, by the increased usage of ballots and drop boxes. What does that have to do with, like, what is that, what exactly do you think is the rationale tying some sort of chaos from the elections to these specific provisions in the bill?
On the food and water, I do think it's an anti-vote buying thing, because under the Georgia law, anybody can donate food and drink as long as you give it to election workers and they set it out. You just can't give it directly to voters in line. And poll workers can still provide water, you know, sua sponte. So I don't know if we're arguing over adjectives about whether something's expansive or restrictive or whatever, but to me this doesn't seem materially different from the New York law, and is justified as a you know, don't influence the voters in line by trying to bribe them with, you know, whatever food or whatever. Your broader question, so there's no in-person voter fraud. There's no material in-person voter fraud. There seems to be some, or at least a possibility of some, depending on who you ask and which study. It's a little too early because there's been such a rapid expansion of mail-in voting and early absentee and things like this, where there is more room for fraud. And so the idea is, you know, a lot of election rules are put in not just to administer elections efficiently and effectively, but also to fuel a public confidence in the integrity of elections. And so even if voter ID doesn't matter that much, it might be good to have if that enhances the confidence of the public in the proper functioning of the elections and therefore the governance it produces. So similarly, standardizing where drop boxes are or what election voting hours are, you know, just cleaning stuff up. And there's a wide range, there's no constitutional right to like 23 days of early voting. I don't think there's a constitutional right to any days of early voting, but you can have a public policy debate over, you know, what the proper level should be. And if we compared what Georgia's new law provides compared to what Georgia provided pre-pandemic, just 2 or 3 years ago, people would say, wow, this is a wide liberalization of look how many more opportunities to vote Georgia is providing. And so all this is a tightening up and a clarifying and standardizing. You could disagree. I might disagree with this or that provision. I might like, you know, this there, but that ultimately does not rise to any sort of legal claim, but, you know, say how should we better administer our elections.
So there were two things in the 2020 election that happened at the same time: a massive expansion in mail-in voting, and also a lower rate of rejection for mail-in ballots than in prior elections. And so I'm wondering how we reconcile those two things.
Yeah, I don't know. I don't know. Maybe it could be, you know, if they're matching, you know, signature matching is not a science. It's more like, you know, feeling people's heads to discern something like that. It's so I don't know whether they're matching the voter files they're matching are better or what's going on there. But that's one of the reasons, you know, to enhance people's confidence in the integrity of the system. I think it is something that needs to be better controlled. But I don't have an answer for that. I saw your hand. Yep.
Yeah, thank you for coming today. So I guess in regards to your analogy about chemotherapy and I guess Jim Crow or whatever ailments led to the provision of Section 5 of the Veterans Act being enacted, what mechanisms in which you suggest states or the federal government do impose if essentially that cancer resurges? I think it seems like you're under the assumption that once it stops raining or once the cancer goes away, it's not going to come back. So
well, it hasn't. If it does, then a Section 5 could be in theory justified again. Because again, you look at Katzenbach, the 1966 case, and it talks about the election regulations always being one step of the law, the court rulings. You know, we can't do this, fine, we'll do that. We can't do this, we'll do that. You know, and so there needed to be this federal receiver over the bankrupt, state agencies. That extraordinary inversion of how election regulation is supposed to do under our constitutional order was justified. And what the court said in Shelby County wasn't that it can never be justified. That's the Thomas position, which I agree. But what they simply ruled was at least you have to have burdens matching evidence of discrimination. And that the coverage formula system wasn't updated in 40 years, the court found. That can't justify it. But we have Section 3, we have Section 2, as I said, which actually requires proof of discrimination to stop it, the same sort of standard as in discrimination laws regarding housing and education and employment. And there's Section 3, which, as I said, can impose like a mini preclearance or court supervision over particularly recalcitrant jurisdictions where that kind of localized cancer, if it ever resurges. So the case has not been made, in my mind, that those are insufficient to meet our current needs, such that this extraordinary deviation from our constitutional order is again justified.
These, I guess this is probably for both speakers, but do you all see this sort of tension over voting integrity, voting access as being something that sticks around for a while, or do you see it as sort of a short-term political expedient where it's a hot issue for now, but should different elections come out different ways, should there be some other thing that comes down the pipe judicially or legislatively? Is this something that is sort of in the midterm sitting with us, or is it just sort of the hobby horse of the day, it's good for making money, but we'll get off the hamster wheel when it stops?
I guess this is asks our personal opinion. I mean, I'm a simple constitutional lawyer, so this is worth what you're paying for it. But it's obviously an unhealthy thing for our society. This lower level of institutional trust, assumption of ill faith on your political opponents, etc. And this manifests itself across Supreme Court reform, across a whole host of different sorts of issues to which there are no easy answers. I don't know. The voting wars, as I said, really I think can be traced to Bush v. Gore. And there were reforms put in, but look at what happened after Bush v. Gore. Florida, of all states, large, unruly, lots of people moving in, linguistic issues, racially, right? Runs probably like the best state, election administration because of a lot of reforms that were put in. They had their swing state. They had their tabulations done, sealed, and in by the time you went to bed on election night 2020. I think if that were done in more states, then that would do a lot to turn down the heat on voting wars. Will, I don't know if you have other ideas.
Yeah, I'm also bad at predictions, but it's hard to see how this goes away. I guess that's like, the incentives are set up for this kind of polarization. The incentives are set up for elites in both parties to continue to stoke this kind of polarization. And indeed, if you don't, you kind of look like a whip, right? Everybody wants to know, you fought as hard as you could. And once the baseline moves that, only whips concede that they lost, everybody else insists that they really won, then it's hard to decide to take that step. And it's an area where, it's actually hard to figure out what's going on. If I tell you the 2020 election was not stolen and try to prove it to you, it's very hard to prove, right? There are all these different factual claims about what happened, and you'll want to know about the 57,000 ballots in Detroit that all appeared at 11:58, and then maybe I can luck into finding somebody who explained what happened there, but all of us are relying only on secondary sources, and you don't trust the secondary sources. It's there's even less of a kind of easily proved fact of the matter than some stuff about science that we're incredibly polarized about too. So it's hard to see how it goes away. It's hard to see either how we all come to our senses or.
So I actually ran for school board in Falls Church, Virginia this past cycle, and my little town bucked the red wave in Virginia, so I was not elected. So people are asking, even though it was a nonpartisan election, there was all these smears about Cato, and apparently I had a libertarian bias towards civil liberties. That was a problem, the way the local newspaper. Anyway, that's neither here nor there. But people were asking, so are you going to demand a recount? I'm like, no. I was only going to demand a recount if I had won. So this way. And the silver lining of this result is that now I don't have to serve on school board, so I'm perfectly happy. Back row in the blue. Yeah.
So as a policy matter, I take your point, I guess, that these reforms are sort of negligible or maybe rationally related to a kind of atmosphere of concern, but should we have an interest collectively in a norm of confidence? So
Sorry, confidence or competence?
confidence.
Okay.
And should we have an interest in sort of being proud that there are peaceful transitions of power where for hundreds of years the losing party accepted the result? And And so therefore, shouldn't we just independently be concerned when most of the reforms that have the effect of tightening the vote after an election come from states where the majority party in control of state government was unhappy with the national result? You know, notwithstanding what those reforms even may do or what effect they may have, but doesn't it just seem problematic from the point of view of promoting shared confidence in the outcome of elections, that now what's going to happen is whichever party loses at the state level will change the rules of the game as a kind of protest to the transition of power. And that just seems like it's bad, whether or not the parallels to the 60s or things are reasonable.
So the answer to your first question about whether norms of confidence in the integrity of elections, whether they should be preserved, the answer is yes. I think that came across in my case in chief. But because of that yes, the answer to your second question is no. That is, to the extent that the new rules, the tweaks, the tightening, whatever, produces a net higher confidence in the integrity of elections, that's a good thing. And assuming that they don't actually, racially disenfranchise or do these other things, violate other norms and things like that. Like I said, the strongest argument for voter ID, among other things, is to increase that confidence. If we can, just make that one simple rule, add voter ID, and that increases voter confidence 15% without having any effect otherwise, sure, that's great. So similar to these things, if the Georgia changes all of a sudden means that in the next election, those Republicans who think that Trump was his election was stolen now think it's fair, then that's to the good.
We have time for one more.
I think I want to follow up on the last two questions asked because my thought goes in the same direction. You said that probably the changes we see are not so much motivated by actually voter fraud happening, but by the feeling that the electorate has, and that people don't trust that much anymore in the election system. So, I mean, after this election, having seen on the big stage one of the candidates claiming voter fraud, I would have the fear that we're kind of dealing with a self-fulfilling prophecy here. So we are enacting new laws because we think the people doesn't believe that much anymore in the system, but doesn't the changes we see right now just make them believe even stronger in that the system was broken before, not as good as it should have been before? So maybe my question is, shouldn't these changes made in the voting rights on the state level be accompanied by those making the changes say out loud that the last election wasn't as bad as some people said it was?
Well, there's no deus ex machina to say that. I mean, I could say, sure, that would be great. That would be a confidence building measure as well. So I guess my answer is yes, that would be great if they simultaneously said that. Similarly, it would be a net negative. I mean, this is an empirical question. You put in these changes, which have no practical effect, but decrease overall confidence because the increase in confidence from those who like the new ballot integrity measures is overcome by the decrease in confidence by people who now think that these are voter suppression measures. That's no good either, right? So, I mean, this gets into the realm of psychology and things like this. But at the end of the day, for constitutional purposes, for legal purposes, I have a problem with people being denied the right to vote. If you want to put in some measure that increases confidence and doesn't affect people's ability to vote, have at it.
Unfortunately, we're out of time, so let's join me in thanking our speakers.